Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this special panel session on leadership succession in North Korea. I'm Curtis Milhaupt, Director of the Center for Japanese Legal Studies at the Law School, and we have a terrific panel with us today. As everyone knows, Kim Jong-il's death in December created leadership, with the death, leadership passed to his son, Kim Jong-un, raising even more questions than usually exist in North Korea. And we have just a terrific panel with us today to help us make sense of these events. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. You have, I think, full bios in your materials, so I'm going to be very brief with the introductions. And our program will entail following about brief presentations of about 5 minutes by each of our panelists, just to get our thoughts moving, and then we'll go to Q&A. I've received some questions in advance from all of you, and so we'll have at least an hour for Q&A, and we'll end the session at 2 o'clock. So our panelists, first, Charles Armstrong, as I'm sure all of you know, specialist in modern Korean history. He's also the director of the Center for Korean Research and has done extensive writing on Korea and East Asian history. Jeong-Ho is the director of the Center for Korean Legal Studies at the Law School. Among other things, Professor Rowe served as the legal advisor to the Keto Project and is an expert on both North and South Korean legal regimes. Sumi Terry, currently senior research scholar at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute and also serving with a strategic investment advisory firm as a former senior analyst, North Korea analyst with the CIA. And finally, Joel Witt was a key participant in the Keto process. He was with the State Department's Office of Strategic Nuclear Policy, and among other things, is also currently a senior research scholar at Weatherhead. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Charles for some brief introductory remarks. Charles?
Thank you very much, Curtis. It's great to see all of you here and to be on this very distinguished panel. I think my job as the professor of history here is to give a little bit of the historical background, historical perspective on where we are now in North Korea. I do think that history matters. This was not a system that was born yesterday, and there's a certain lack of perspective in a lot of the media coverage since Kim Jong-il's death about the current state of the North Korean regime. So just in a couple of minutes, I want to say why I'm not surprised that the leadership transition is apparently going smoothly, and why I think the regime is much more stable than many people give it credit for. I think there's a certain misunderstanding that many people have from the outside about North Korea that tends to go to one or another extreme. North Korea, I think, is not simply a one-man dictatorship, and nor is it a dynastic system in which there's a kind of emperor-like figure above it all. Rather, the North Korean political system is centered around the family of Kim Il-sung, but operates through a collective leadership, as it were, of different parties and different interests and different individuals in the military, in the party, and in other areas of the system. This is a system that was set up essentially in the 1960s, late 1960s, early 1970s, under Kim Il-sung, who wanted to find a solution to the problem of instability that was faced particularly by the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin, which was a regime which had a tremendous influence on North Korea, on Kim specifically. And he came to the conclusion, it seems, that the best way to prevent instability was to keep a tightly controlled, tightly centered political system run by his family in a kind of hereditary succession. But it wasn't simply that Kim Jong-il became the leader because he was the eldest son in a kind of system of primogeniture. Rather, there was a process of competition of Kim Jong-il proving himself, particularly against his uncle Kim Yong-ju, which seemed to Kim Il-sung's younger brother, who was for a while the most likely contender for the throne. In about 1973, 1974, Kim Jong-il won out in that competition, and it was from that point onward that the North Korean system continued to move toward this type of hereditary succession that we see today. So when we hear a lot about Kim Jong-un's lack of experience, questions of whether or not he will last. I think that's somewhat beside the point. The system isn't just built around Kim Jong-un. The system exists in itself with these different power interests. Kim Jong-un is an important component of that, but he isn't necessarily the linchpin, and he himself emerged out of a process of competition. From what we gather, we don't know a lot of the details, against his own siblings. So Kim Il-sung was actually quite successful in a way. In some ways, this was a problem, but in terms of the goals of what he and those around him created 30 years ago, this has actually worked quite well. It's not simply that North Korea has had only a couple of years to prepare for Kim Jong-il's death, but rather the system as such has had decades to create this kind of entrenched process of hereditary rule. What we then will see in North Korea, it seems to me, is a continuation of this political transition and no real radical change. I think there will be a political continuity. There will be perhaps a return to very limited, very controlled economic interaction with the outside world, and resumption, as we've already seen, of dialogue with the United States, which had been underway since last July. So, North Korea as a regime, in my view, is not going away anytime soon, and Kim Jong-un as a leader will, unless something truly unexpected and dramatic happens, remain in power for the foreseeable future. Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. Jeong-Ho.
Thank you. I'm Jeong-Ho Roh, Director of the Korean Legal Studies at Columbia Law School. And what I wanted to do was provide a little bit of the legal framework for understanding this. Now, Charles mentioned earlier that this kind of hereditary succession politically had been in process for a number of years. Essentially, that's also true in the legal sense, is that the new Constitution, the amendment to the Constitution, really embodies that succession very, very clearly by stating in the preamble that Kim Il-sung will be the eternal president of North Korea. Now, that obviously was done after Kim Il-sung's death by Kim Jong-il. And in a way, if you look at the significance of that particular preamble to the Constitution, it in fact sets the stage for continued succession through the family lineage of the Kim family. Now, one of the interesting things about the Constitution in North Korea is that there is no provision for succession. And this is one of the kind of telling aspects that is absent that actually really, I think, belies the kind of importance or the strategy for family succession from a legal perspective. But aside from that, and I think we'll have other legal questions, what I wanted to also focus on today was the New Year's editorial that North Korea publishes every year. And I think this is actually very telling in a sense that what happens during the New Year's editorial really, I think, foreshadows the way North Korea looks at the world and the way they kind of envision the future for North Korea. It's almost like the State of Union address you have in the United States, but something that most North Korean watchers, I think, read very carefully for signs of what's happening. Just in case I run out of time, I think I'm giving 5 minutes. Let me give you the conclusion first so that if I do run out of time, you at least know what I'm talking about. The conclusion first is that succession is very much underway. And the succession will basically progress in a manner that I think most people think as smooth. Now, the reason why is if you look at the New Year's editorial, there are some highlights I wanted to kind of stress here that kind of gives you an idea as to where North Korea is going. One of the most interesting aspects of the New Year's editorial is one phrase I thought I still can't understand. It says, "The death of Kim Jong-il was the greatest loss our nation has suffered in its 5,000-year history." I would have thought the death of Kim Il-sung might have done that, but for some reason they start this editorial by saying the death of Kim Jong-il is one of the most significant aspects of the tragedy in North Korea. And then they go on basically to immediately legitimize the succession by saying, well, in effect, Kim Jong-il has safeguarded the valuable heritage that Kim Il-sung has bequeathed on the people. That's an important part because in a way what's happening is they're linking now Kim Jong-il to Kim Il-sung. And then basically the problem here is in the editorial, unfortunately he was not able to finish this revolutionary work because he died. And I think everybody now knows the conclusion of what's going to happen is that, so therefore Kim Jong-un has to continue this particular activity that has been started by Kim Il-sung, followed by Kim Jong-il, and the natural progression or the legitimacy, so to speak, now falls onto Kim Jong-un. One of the phrases I really want to also emphasize here is the term that they use is that this year, 2012, everywhere else in the world is 2012, but in North Korea it's Juche 101. As you know, they have a different calendar according to when Kim Il-sung was born in 1912. It's the 100th year of his birth. And they say this is a new century, I'm quoting here, of Kim Il-sung's Korea beginning, and they emphasize under one ideology and one bloodline. And this is, in a way, I think the most important part of this news editorial is that they now, for the first time, really recognize that one bloodline is now the kind of way North Korea will affect this succession, maybe post Kim Jong-un as well. And in a way, I think this form of kind of continuation is a very important part. And it ends really by saying that, and I quote again, "Let us all glorify the new century of Kim Il-sung's Korea as an era of prosperity and proud victory under the leadership of Kim Jong-un, the supreme leader of our party, our state, and our army." And this is the way it ends, this editorial. Now, I think different people will look at this differently, but as far as this editorial goes, it's an important written piece of work that now I think legitimizes from North Korea's perspective what it intends to do, which is really now carry on full speed the kind of process of succession. And I think as time goes by, we'll see little renditions of how they're going to do that. But nonetheless, this is I think the beginning point that I think people should look at.
Okay, thanks, Jeong-Ho. Sumi.
All right, let me be very honest. Since I don't have prepared remarks, and to just make the conversation quite interesting and fun, I think I will just comment on what my previous speaker said and just maybe take a different position just to make the conversation a bit more interesting. Let me also first begin by saying no one knows anything really about North Korea. We just have, we're just speculating, all of us. I mean, I'm coming from the intelligence community, so I can tell you that we know very little about North Korea. We knew very little about Kim Jong-un. Everything that was said in New York Times is pretty much what we kind of knew about Kim Jong-un. Whatever the sushi chef said about Kim Jong-un's temperament and personality and Kim Jong-il's favorite son, blah, 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 that's what we knew about Kim Jong-un. So we know very little about North Korea. So I think that's what you guys should be aware of. We didn't know that Kim Jong-il died until North Korea chose to tell us that Kim Jong-il died. South Korean intelligence service didn't know. United States intelligence service didn't know. Nobody knew until North Koreans said Kim Jong-il died. We don't even really know how he died, right? We just know what North Koreans told us to. So it's a big mystery, and we're just trying to figure it out. Now, in terms of how stable, there are two camps, I think, right now. North Korea watchers are looking at North Korea, and there are two camps. There is one camp, and you just kind of heard this theory, and it's joined by very distinguished, serious North Korea watchers, Evans Revere and so on, or you guys, in terms of how the succession is going, that it's been going on, it was in the process way before Kim Jong-il died, and now it's going, all the ducks are in a row, things are going as planned, and they're doing all the right things, saying the right things, taking the right photos, and going through this whole process. The other camp, Victor, Charles of the world, and some other people think that, listen, Kim Jong-un does not, he did not have enough time. I mean, we knew that Kim Jong-un was sick and he was not doing well and that he would eventually die, but it did come a little bit too soon, a little bit too suddenly. And Kim Jong-un did not have all this time that Kim Jong-il had for 2 decades plus to really prepare him. He is 28 or 29 years old. Maybe it doesn't matter the bloodline, all this, but this is also North Korea, the age matters, respect matters, all that matters. Can you imagine this guy who's 29 years old, did not serve a day in the military, being called a 4-star general, and are the older elites really behind him, supporting this guy? Yes, they are, because they have vested interest in this, keeping the system going, and as clearly evidenced by what's going on. And even the intelligence community and everybody in the U.S. government, we knew that elites will rally together and really support the succession process because they have an interest in keeping the system together. But is this going to go on in a stable manner? For how long? The first time there's a real crisis or there is a true, controversial policy decisions have to be made. Can he really does he have the capacity and the capability to lead this place? Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. But there are several scenarios, and we don't know. We just know what North Koreans are choosing to show us right now. And that's why I would like to argue that it's one of several scenarios. One scenario is that North Korea's succession process is moving on smoothly, like we think it is. Second scenario is, and it is probably moving on smoothly, but I think that over the period, and particularly if there's a crisis situation, and when you have to make really controversial policy decisions, I think you will see a little bit of unraveling with this elite support. Or the second scenario is that there could be, and look at what Kim Jong-nam is doing, right? The first son. I mean, he's also this bloodline. I mean, he has legitimacy too, and he's running around Macau and talking to all kinds of people, saying really pretty amazing things about North Korea. I mean, he has a death wish on his head, running around. If I was Kim Jong-un, I would go and he should be dead, because he does have legitimacy as the oldest son. So really, all the elites in North Korea are completely ignoring him. This must enter their brain that what Kim Jong-nam is saying. Do they really? So I do think that you will see some unraveling of elite support, or at least that's a possibility. You got to think of it as a possibility that over this initial period, maybe a year or 3 years, as they move along, there will be. I don't think that he will be able to have that kind of support that Kim Jong-un had. And without a dominant arbiter like Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and as things get really tense, I just don't see how they could keep the system going. Already under Kim Jong-il, there were various stresses to this regime that were from economic malaise to corruption to indiscipline to bribery to information penetration. It's not the same. It was decreasing, eroding, or even under Kim Jong-il. And now it's under Kim Jong-un. And I do have to say, it is an opportunity. It is a different period. And I think the U.S. needs to do more than what we've been doing and think about different scenarios. At least recognize that it is a potential possibility that things could unravel. And you need to have a serious contingency planning. And we don't really have a serious contingency planning. We have military planning with South Korea, joint military planning. South Koreans have their own also planning. But it's not really, we have not done enough strategic thinking. We have not done enough planning. And I am very worried about how North Korea could potentially, there's many different directions it could go. And I think we should challenge this notion that everything is just going so smoothly just because that's what they choose to tell us right now.
All right, thank you, Sumi. We seem to now have we now have some divergence of opinion on the panel, so that should spark some discussion. Finally, Mr. Witt.
Thank you. I guess this is taped to the. Can I move this over?
Please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am not going to wade into the hyper analysis of what's going to happen in the future in North Korea because. I agree with my colleague. There are a number of different scenarios, and I have no idea which one's going to play out. And moreover, I have no idea when they're going to play out. So my problem is, having sat in the perspective of a policymaker for a number of years, I've seen people get so bogged down in these kinds of discussions that it leads to nothing happening on the policy front. And so what I'd like to propose is that all of these scenarios are possible. That's, I think we can all agree on that. On contingency planning, sure, we should have lots of contingency planning. I have a friend who was in charge of contingency planning at the Pentagon, and he said to me once that, he wished we could spend less time on contingency planning and more time on thinking about what to do now. in terms of dealing with North Korea. So I think there's a lot of thinking going on that front. To me, what's important in terms of recent events is what are the policy implications for the United States, and how do we proceed from where we are now? And there's a related issue which is directly connected to the transition, and that is, will there be continuity in North Korean policy or a lack of continuity? Will North Korea gradually change, not just in terms of domestic policy, but particularly in terms of its foreign policy and its security policy? This is the big challenge for us now. We need to figure this out somehow. And sitting here and discussing it is all well and good, but we're not going to figure it out in this room today. The only way to figure it out is for the United States to become much more proactive in trying to make contact with the North Koreans and seeing what's possible in the future. And I think, as many of you probably noticed, in the past day, there's been an announcement that there will be another meeting between the United States and North Korea in Beijing, and I guess that's the end of next week. That could be a sign of continuity in policy. We don't know, and I really urge all of you to not believe anything you read in newspapers on these particular topics. There's a lot of crap. And it's really, I mean, I hate to say it, but the American press and the Korean press on how they report these issues, it's just disgraceful, I think. So, will there be continuity in terms of North Korean policy? And when I say continuity may be a good thing, it's because we were on the right trajectory before Kim Jong-il died. We had a few years of problems, obviously, but if you recall, before Kim Jong-il died, the U.S. and North Korea were talking about a deal to suspend the uranium enrichment program in North Korea, to provide North Korea with food aid, and to restart the six-party talks. I was in North Korea before Kim Jong-il died, and my very strong impression from our discussions with some of the officials there was that North Korea was serious about moving down this more positive track. And in fact, they were doubtful that the United States was really serious about it, and I can get into that some more. But there was a policy direction at that point which I think can lead us down the right path. And so if the meetings the end of February pick up where that left off, then I think the next year might not be too bad. There's been a lot of predicting about the next year, a lot of predicting about Kim Jong-un and him wanting to conduct more nuclear tests and more missile tests, and that's not the path they were on. So we'll have to see what happens the end of February. To me, another interesting question, which I'm going to end with this comment, which may not be directly relevant here, is that, in the region itself, we're not just talking about a transition in North Korea. We're talking about transitions in all of the other major actors. We're talking about transition in South Korea, in the United States, and in China over the next year. And I shouldn't leave Russia out. There's going to be a transition there too. So to me, it's interesting, how will the transition in North Korea play out and interact with these other changes? And let me give you one example. It seems to me that it's quite likely that in South Korea, there's going to be a big change in the direction of South Korean policy. Not so much because, South Koreans are fed up with President Lee's policy towards North Korea. I think they're just fed up with President Lee and the ruling party. And so you could get a very distinct change in the leadership. And along with that will come a very distinct change in South Korean policy towards North Korea. That's a transition that I think is really worth watching, because we're not going to have continuity in South Korean policy. And that's going to affect the dealings with North Korea. It's also going to affect U.S.-South Korean relations as well. So I'm going to stop there since we have very limited time. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much to all of our panelists. It raises lots of issues. Let me ask one question, and then I'll open up the floor to questions. And as those lag, I'll read some of the questions that were submitted in advance. Talking about legitimacy of Kim 3 and the possibility of policy change, is it naive to ask why the Chinese path to reform or some version of it is not attractive to the North Korean leadership? Why doesn't China offer a model of a way out of North Korea's mess and many of its problems? Again, maybe that's a very naive question, but it's something that I've wondered about often. Any chance of Chinese-style reform taking place under Kim 3?
No, but go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. But let me just elaborate that a little bit by saying that it's too politically dangerous. I mean, they would like to have the economic benefits of that, and the Chinese have been pushing that reform model on them for decades, and they don't like it. First of all, the North Koreans don't want anyone telling them what to do, including the Chinese. But second, it opens up too many scary possibilities as far as the regime is concerned of what would happen if they really did open up. So one phrase, Deng Xiaoping used to talk about this green door approach to capitalism in the 80s, and then the North Koreans tightened it up by calling their approach the mosquito net approach to capitalism. But I think even that is perhaps too much of an opening for them. So no, in the near term, it's unlikely.
I agree with Charles. I mean, several pillars of stability. The way that North Koreans were able to keep the state stable, or like monopoly on information control, population control, and so on. And with economic reform, they're afraid that those things will have pressure. This just opens up too many different possibilities they don't want to get to and lose the regime control. Also, I think Kim Jong-un particularly can't move away from Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il's policies or legacies. I mean, that's what, it's just too, he just moved into the scene. He can't just, right now, he doesn't have the weight, right, the gravitas to even if you wanted that, you would have had higher chance under Kim Jong-il, which was no chance. But so with Kim Jong-un, it's even more difficult. He just can't.
Let me just add one point. I hate to keep banging on the press, but whenever you read an article about North Korea, you see a line that says the hermit kingdom. And in fact, it's not a hermit kingdom. And I agree with what everyone's saying about Chinese economic style reform. It's been in the wind for decades and they haven't done it. On the other hand, I think it's worth noting that this isn't a place that's frozen in time. I mean, it has changed a lot in the time I've been going there since 1995. And it's changed on any number of levels, but still, on the main issues such as the economy and economic reform, it hasn't changed that much. There were periods when they seemed to be ready to change, but they didn't. So what we're looking at here, it may be a very different model where it changes very gradually as through seepage from the outside world, rather than any dramatic steps by the leadership.
Can I just, sorry, one more thing to that, sorry, Jeong-Ho, just to say, it's also change coming up from below. There is marketization that's been going on for almost 20 years. If you go out to the countryside, even in Pyongyang now, you see markets. So it's not the same kind of top-down marketization, but if anything, if we see reform, it's a kind of legitimization by the state of what's already been happening from below.
If I could just add just one thing about Professor Milhaupt's comment, is just that from Kim Jong-un's perspective, really, he's had the leadership kind of handed to him on a system-wide basis already. So for his perspective, the Constitution, Juche, the New Year's editorial, etc., all of that really now systematically has been handed to him, and he has no incentive really now at this point, before consolidating his power, to either move towards reform or change to a Chinese style. And he needs to now maximize what he has right now, what's being handed to him.
Okay, thank you. Let's open the floor to questions. I think there is a mic, so just make sure. Yes, please. Please identify yourself.
My name is Jeong-Ho, and I'm a retired employee of Columbia University. I think of Chris Hill in the last few years, and it makes me think it's possible for the U.S. to be less hostile. So I don't understand quite why we speculate about DPRK. Why can't we, sitting in the U.S., which is a very large country, sort of have any influence on the U.S. policy toward less hostility and toward more engagement from a constructive point of view? It seems to me that would be the constructive input to DPRK rather than our speculation of what will happen or might happen or can happen. And yet there seems to be a particular block from this gathering and other gatherings having any influence on the U.S. policies. So my question is, why can't we, or is there any way to, or why speculate about that? Can't we try to push the U.S.?
You want to go first? Go ahead.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't sense a great popular uprising in terms of U.S. policy towards North Korea. So, I think it's interesting and useful to have these kinds of meetings, but I can't see how the U.S. public is going to nudge the administration in a different direction. What's going on with U.S. policy today, and I'm sure, or maybe people will disagree, is that basically there are three factors that determine or can determine our policy. It's national interests, it's alliance relations, and it's domestic politics. Right now, my perspective is that what's determining our policy is more alliance relations and domestic politics than national interests. National interest to me means that we do need to engage. We need a policy towards North Korea that is a comprehensive policy that isn't just talking to them, but includes everything else that we have at our disposal. The problem is, without talking to them, we're missing an indispensable link. And, I know all the arguments about why we shouldn't be talking to them because of what they've done the past few years, because the South Korean government doesn't want us to talk to them, because, Republicans will get angry, and all of those are good arguments. But at the end of the day, I think a responsible policymaker has to balance those arguments with an assessment of our national security interests. And from my perspective, that hasn't happened the past 3 years.
Just on the U.S. policy, we did try to engage. If you remember, after Clinton and when Bush first came into the office, there was a so-called hardline approach for first term. Axis of Evil, 2002, State of the Union address, the whole thing. Don't want to talk to North Koreans. And then there was the first nuclear test by North Koreans. And then Bush was severely criticized for its hardline policy. And then it reversed course for the second term and tried to talk to them. This is your Chris Hill era. And so it's not, and then, so there was a whole complete reversal. So maybe the problem we have to ask is also North Koreans. It's not like it's U.S.'s problem that because we tried to engage, we tried the hardline policy. And when Obama came into the office, it was not like when Bush came to the office and completely reversing everything that Clinton did, right? Or anything but Clinton ABC policy. When Obama came into the office, he thought a continuity with Bush's second term North Korea policy, engagement, six-party talks was a good thing, and we were going to do that. Obama didn't do anything when for North Korea, for the first 6 months of the Obama administration, decided to do another nuke test, a couple missile tests, complete withdrawal from the six-party talks. So at least you can blame Bush for his hardline policy for North Korea's actions. What can North Koreans say to Obama's first 6 months? Because he was not, we will do this. But I'm just saying, it's not, maybe the problem is also the North Koreans. It's not like, have U.S. tried this or that? I think we tried.
Look, Sue, I think you and I probably agree more than it's going to sound, but of course the problem's the North Koreans. I mean, everyone knows what North Korea is. I mean, anyone who's worked on the North Korea issue in a policy agency like the State Department, like the White House, everyone knows what we're dealing with. And so I don't mean to say that this is the U.S.'s fault. I'm saying that if I'm sitting in a seat as a responsible policymaker in the U.S. government, I have to first recognize what I'm dealing with here, which is not a country that if we were only nice to them, they would be nice back to us.
Right.
That's not the point here. The point here is to secure results that are in our national interests. And so let me give you an example, since we're going to get into a little bit of history. I'm going to go back. You know, history started before President Bush. History started 10 years before President Bush in the Clinton administration on this issue. Or earlier, yeah, but at least in terms of U.S. engagement policy. Actually, it started under President Reagan, but let me give you an example, because I think there's something that Sue is reflecting, and I respect her view, which is basically there's this kind of view that you can't work with the North Koreans. You can't negotiate with them. You know, they're only going to take advantage of you. They're only going to end up, you know, stabbing you in the back. All of that is possible, which is why you need to be careful. No, it's not proven by decades. And let me give you an example. Everyone maligns the 1994 agreed framework. Well, if you were sitting in my seat in 1993, there were intelligence estimates, not based on human sources, based on hard facts, that said North Korea would have enough material to build 100 nuclear weapons by 2000, by the year 2000. We reached the agreement. We got to 2002, the agreement collapsed. They weren't anywhere near that. They had maybe enough material for 5 nuclear weapons. Moreover, it wasn't just because of our agreement. They were dumb enough to let their facilities run down to the point where they couldn't restart a number of them. So that was a negotiation that worked, even though people say, you can't negotiate with these guys. So I guess I'm just arguing we need to discard that myth that you can't reach agreements with these guys that work in your interest. And you need to be careful about how you reach agreements with them. That's the bottom line for me.
Okay, question over here, please. Yeah, please wait for the mic. Right over here.
Where's the question?
Right here.
My name's Alice. My name's Alice LeBrie. I'm former U.S. Department of State Foreign Service. I served under Richard Holbrooke.
Is the microphone on?
Can you speak up?
It's for the video.
Thank you. I don't know if it's on.
It's on, it's on.
I've served under Richard Holbrooke at the U.S. mission to the UN and Negroponte and Kalingrad. And it has always been my feeling that North Korea has a right to have nuclear weapons. You know, other countries have it. Every country has a right to protect itself. And one quick quote, Mr. Witt, about the press. I wrote Rupert Murdoch and told him that his coverage was disrespectful of the transition, so I see him calm down a bit. But my question is, Ms. Perry, I mean, can't we get along? Can't we just go for trade and stay out of the rest of their business, you know?
Go for trade?
Trade.
Trade with North Korea?
Yeah.
But they need to trade what?
Well, find something so that we can get along.
But it's a two-way street. They need to also want to trade with. I mean, right? So it's not like we can force it. And in the nuclear issue, you're saying just never mind the nuclear issue, let them develop nuclear weapons, and that's fine. You're saying?
Yeah.
Well, that's one opinion. I mean, I don't want to argue that point with you because that's.
I'm not arguing, I just
Yeah, no, I'm saying no. That I fundamentally disagree with that perspective because I feel that that's very dangerous for the East Asia security. If you let the North Korean, I mean, that has a lot of ramification for other countries. Our policy towards Iran, it's not an isolated thing that you can just let it happen. If we just say, okay, another country can just sit there and build nuclear weapons, I mean, what are we saying about to the rest of the world? I mean, Iran is a good example. I mean, I'm just saying this is what the policymakers are thinking about. It's not an isolated thing. Everything is connected. And North Korea, I have to say, is a serial proliferator. We do not want North Korea to have any kind of They already proliferate everything they have. They will sell it to anybody. I'm not necessarily saying the North Koreans will sell nuclear weapons to the terrorists. I think they have more of a survival instinct than that. And then never mind the whole nuclear arms race that could happen. So if North Korea has nuclear weapons, what would Japan do? I mean, now Japan is sitting in this whole region with China having nuclear weapons, Russia having nuclear weapons, now North Korea, and what about South Korea? I mean, I personally. So everybody should have nuclear weapons. I mean, but this is a perspective that I just fundamentally disagree with. I don't need to further elaborate.
I agree with Sue 100%. And so, when people, I've said this many times that we need to be talking to these guys, but I'm saying it from a realist perspective on our interests. And so, if I have a realist perspective, which I do. I don't want North Korea having nuclear weapons. And honestly, I just don't accept the excuse for them having it because other countries do. I mean, that's not what a realist perspective on Northeast Asia tells me. It tells me that this is a region of the world that is best off if countries like South Korea, Japan, and North Korea don't have nuclear weapons, that if the United States and China try to be more cooperative in the region as well to build a better relationship there, and then try to deal with these other nuclear issues between us separately. But I want to see a Northeast Asia that is peaceful and stable. And to me, if everyone has nuclear weapons in Northeast Asia, it's not going to be either one.
Well, can I just add a point that you're making here? Is, the point that I think you're making is if India has nuclear weapons, if Pakistan has it, and Israel may have it, why not North Korea? You're really going into the issue of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty aspects. And since North Korea is no longer a member of that, in a way what you're saying is correct, that legally, from a perspective of the NPT regime, North Korea can have nuclear weapons. They're not a member. But that really goes now to a post-legal to a American foreign policy question, which I think Joel is now addressing. And this is where the kind of difficulty comes in. In North Korea, by right, they feel, sure, I have a right to have nuclear weapons. Nothing illegal about it. Whereas the rest of the world don't look at it that way. And this is where I think the major problem comes in. But if I could just, while I have the mic, just interject one comment that Joel made a minute ago. I think, Joel, you have to remember that the U.S. is not the only player in this region. The other player that is of real big significance as far as North Korea goes is China. And in a way, it's not a bilateral issue that the United States can deal with North Korea directly and forget about all the other players. Just on the meeting that's going to be held next week, China came up with a comment that said, as Kim Jong-un becomes the country's new leader, how much the DPRK will respect China has yet to be seen. They made that comment, that essentially they want to see now whether whether North Korea will in fact now respect China's position in dealing with North Korea. So basically, the question is, well, it's not really a North Korea.
No, I agree, and I think.
Can we just I want to stick on the nuclear issue for 1 second before we move to China, because we have a question directly on point from the audience. I'd like to get the reaction from. It says, it seems the U.S. pays more attention to Iran's nuclear issue than the North Korea issue, and Washington takes a more hardline policy toward Tehran than Pyongyang. During the period of North Korea's power transition, will Washington put more pressure on Pyongyang to give up its nuclear program? So any comments on that point before we move to the China angle?
Well, Joel's worked more in nuclear policy than any of the rest of us, so.
I'm sorry, can you read that again?
U.S. is paying more attention to Iran than to North Korea on the nuclear issue. Is that accurate?
Well, I think it's probably been accurate for the past year or so, and there are probably a number of reasons for that. But I would argue that the situation in terms of dealing with North Korea is there may be more chance of making progress in dealing with them than there is dealing with Iran on their nuclear program. And so if I was sitting in the White House confronted with, all sorts of things going on in the world, but I have these two major non-proliferation problems, Iran and North Korea, and so I'd be thinking, well, can I deal with at least one of them? And I would say the answer is yes. I think North Korea is an area where we can make some progress, and that's another reason why we should be much more serious about trying to engage the North. But can I answer?
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Well, I don't want to. I mean, if someone else wants to say something about the nuclear.
I just wanted to make one remark as someone who has never had the privilege or misfortune of working in U.S. foreign policy. From my point of view, it seems one of the fundamental problems is a difference of priorities on the two sides, North Korea and the United States. And the U.S. has really been focused on North Korea as a nuclear proliferation issue. And is this necessarily the best way to look at North Korea? And is that, in fact, part of the problem? North Korea, on the other hand, seems to feel that its number one priority, understandably, is its own security. And it's been very difficult to come from these two quite different points of view to an agreement. I mean, do we feel that there has been progress made in each understanding the other's sense of their own national interest and coming somehow to somewhere in the middle where we reach an agreement on that? Are we any closer to that now than we were 9 years ago when the six-party talks began? Oh, and one other thing to Sue's remark, it's good to have contingency plans. I'm all for that. But there is a danger of contingencies blending into wishful thinking. And I get concerned that there's too much hope for events proceeding in a certain way in North Korea, which keep getting deferred. My point is simply not that North Korea will be around forever or Kim Jong-un will be leader forever, but we have to deal with North Korea the way it is now and not wish and hope for and wait for a change.
Just on that comment, I actually, in the contingency planning, I really meant political reconstruction plan. I didn't mean so military focused, by the way. And I do think if it happens, if unification one day comes, it's such a monumental task. I just don't know if the region is prepared for that. The national reconstruction plan, as we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's a monumental plan. It's not about military contingency plan, which we have from Pentagon and South Korea and all over the place.
I don't know if I can get back to the China point about the role of China in all this, but I totally agree. I mean, this isn't just a U.S. problem, although I may have made it sound like that. But the problem for the U.S. is constructing a policy that also brings China along, because China is critical. China has influence in North Korea, although I suspect not as much as everyone thinks they have. But we definitely need a policy that does that. And the problem has been, at least in the past 3 years, I hate to keep talking about the past 3 years, but the problem has been China and the U.S. have kind of marched off to opposing corners. China has become much closer to North Korea. The U.S. has become much closer to South Korea and hasn't engaged North Korea. And so what we're basically at loggerheads here. And so what we need to do is figure out a way to reverse that situation, a way where we can get China to actively support our efforts to secure our national interests, which is mainly dealing with the weapons of mass destruction programs, but also to build peace and stability in the region. Right now, we're not there. We're not even close to there. And so what we need to do is reevaluate our approach.
Questions? Yes, please, sir.
First, a comment about nuclear weapons, and then a question. I think it might be possible to make more progress on non-proliferation issues if we upheld, that is, we, the U.S., upheld more aggressively our end of the NPL treaty, which is to reduce the number of weapons we have more dramatically than we have. Maybe I'm just idealistic. To stop talking about and threatening the use of nuclear bunker busters and to stop with depleted uranium weapons. In other words, if we did less with nuclear stuff, maybe that would have something to do with the other side. But my real question gets back to something that Sue said before, which is about the first crisis. What does anybody in the panel think could be the first crisis that North Korea might be facing? For example, this year being the 100th anniversary is supposed to have something about significant economic progress, which obviously isn't going to happen. Could this be a crisis?
Anybody?
Crisis?
You
Because
brought it up.
because I don't think it's necessarily a crisis. It depends on how the U.S. acts, but we are already prepared for potential next missile launch or nuclear test. I don't think that would be called a significant crisis. Significant economic meltdown, food shortages, but it really depends on how the U.S. behaves, how U.S. responds, right? Or a significant clash with South Korea. Although I do think right now, South Korea and the U.S. this particular year are going to be too preoccupied with their own election, and they are in a very avoid crisis mode. And I think North Koreans are probably not going to engage in the kind of Cheonan, Yeonpyeong kind of activity with South Korea. Hopefully, I'm not sure positive on that, but so I do think the U.S. is prepared, and it is a crisis and it's not a crisis. We've just seen it so many times with North Korea. I don't know if necessarily everybody's going to jump with even a next nuclear test.
I think it's an interesting idea, though, that you may be able to learn things about how this leadership, the new situation functions, if North Korea goes through some sort of crisis. And I wouldn't think it would have to do with external relations, although it might. It might. I mean, I can see different scenarios, but it might have to do with more internal, if they have any internal problems, that are stark or sudden. But I mean, I can't predict what that might be.
Even the currency fiasco,
Right.
Which even that could turn into some sort of a real crisis situation in North Korea.
It could be self-inflicted.
Yeah.
It could be a self-inflicted wound, but they actually handled that pretty adroitly, I think, after they inflicted the wound on themselves. So, it's a good question, and I think it's an interesting concept, but, I don't like to prognosticate about the future, so.
Yes, please.
What U.S., South Korea, and Japan
I'm not sure we got the question.
should do.
Well,
What's a good approach?
The North Korean issue is not only the U.S. policy issue. U.S. should work with other players like Japan or North Korea. So I'd like to ask the expert what would be the good way of approach, or good engagement, or more putting pressure, or more dialogue. Or
There's a difference between what we should do and what we will do, right? Let me first just go, I think, what the region will do. I just mentioned that from U.S. perspective, I think we're trying to engage them in, they will meet in China, and hopefully something will come out of that. But I don't think it's really a proactive approach. I think it's trying to figure out where North Korea really stands. It's kind of exploring stage. As I said, I think in South Korea is also going to be in election mode, and everybody's in this kind of crisis avoidance mode. I don't know if anybody's going to really proactively, strategically move forward, very realistic scenario. And I think Japan is just going to kind of do what the Washington is going to do. So I think that's how, and in China, I think China is also trying to wait and see and see that hopefully how is Kim Jong-un going to respect or not. But I think China is going to just support North Korea with Kim Jong-un. And so everything is going to be pretty much of what we've seen. It's going to be more or less a status quo, I think.
Then what you're suggesting here is that there's no progress will be made. That's
No.
essentially what
No.
you're saying
Yes.
is, then
Yes.
what's the point of talking then?
No,
In other
well,
words,
look,
you know,
here's
Because
the,
it's still
What's the
better
point
to
of us
talk and
talking?
not.
No, not us. What's the point of negotiating with that?
Because to see, you know, it's still better to
That
engage
concludes
them.
our session.
There's no point.
Well, no. The
But-
question
but-
here is just that somehow, you know, many people think it's so important to negotiate with North Korea, that it's important to have a
I think
six-party
they're not
talk.
really going to
And
win.
really, in a way, what the conclusion we've come to is, if nothing's going to come of it, then what is
but that's
the
not,
exact purpose
but
behind
I
it?
don't know if that's what Sue is really saying. Let me,
verify.
I think I agree with you. It is exploratory,
Yeah.
what's going on. We're trying to feel our way. We're trying to see what's possible with a new leadership in North Korea. We're trying to see whether there's continuity in policy. So one outcome of this meeting on the 23rd, and maybe another meeting afterwards, I don't know the timing, might be that the deal that was going to be struck in December before Kim Jong-il died is struck. That, you know, you'll see some food aid from North Korea, you'll see them suspend their uranium enrichment program, they may have a moratorium on nuclear and missile tests, there may be other parts to this deal. So there might be some progress. For me, the interesting issue is that, you know, are we thinking ahead at all? Here we may have this deal, we may make some progress, we may get back to the six-party talks. Then we're going to be confronting some really difficult issues. Well, if we're not willing to confront those issues, why are we going back to the six-party talks? I mean, we need to have a strategy, and I don't think we have that yet.
Yeah.
That's the point. So, you know, I
Yeah,
think
that's
it's a
what I was
little bit different from what you're saying.
On the case of Japan specifically, you know, what Joel said about the lack of domestic constituency for engagement with North Korea and the U.S. is even more the case for Japan. However, it may be, and I hope I'm not engaged in wishful thinking here, but it may be that in a post-Kim Jong-il North Korea, there is greater possibility of the abduction issue being, you know, put on the back burner, at least since Kim Jong-un cannot be held personally responsible for that, and that a new leadership in North Korea will be something that the Japanese are more willing to deal with. That remains to be seen. But I don't think, I wouldn't say nothing is going to happen, but it's hard to imagine, given all the changes going on in all these countries, that much is going to happen this year. So maybe we can look forward to 2013.
Next year's editorial.
But just, I'm sorry, one last point. If we haven't thought about what's going to happen in the six-party talks, and then they collapse because, you know, we're in the transition, we can't do anything, that's going to create a serious problem. That's the
But
point.
because we're in transition, and the same thing happened with Bush's last year. I mean, I know I was there. North Koreans didn't want to make an agreement when they knew there might be a new administration coming in too. So,
That's
and
another
with South
factor,
Korea
yeah.
too, North Korea has no incentive to make any kind of deal with Lee Myung-bak. He's leaving. It's going to be the next administration. That's why I really think this year, not much is going to happen.
Please.
Hi, my name's Miri. I'm a FIPA student. So I guess I feel like we've been talking a lot about kind of like high-level policy making, but just to kind of like bring it down to ground. Just wondering how, you know, 2012 is supposed to be the strong and prosperous nation for North Korea. And just wondering how will that kind of set a tone, first off for Kim Jong-un and his regime to follow, and also media and the use of media has played a big part recently in North Korea. For instance, the new news bureau, the use of cell phones, and just wanted to know your opinion as to kind of like the mobilization of society and the stability of the North Korean regime as they bring in new types of technology and new forms of information technology into the country, and just kind of like the overall.
Your field.
Well, I don't see the government doing that at all. There is more information coming in, cell phone use, and information, unwanted information, is coming in through the Sino-North Korea border. But that's at the public level. I don't see government doing anything to really use the technology or internet or phone use or anything like that. There is no change in policy. In fact, that's what they fear, is having this information penetration, because it's one of the ways to keep the regime stable. But as I was saying, there's as more information comes in, it does make it slightly unstable. I'm not trying to make it sound like it's unstable, but it's not a good thing for the regime. But it is happening with the public a little bit more and more. I mean, with the South Korean DVDs coming in, when I spent some time with North Korean defectors, it's really amazing how they all really up to date with all the South Korean movies and so on, more so than even you are. So there is information coming in, but it's not that is dangerous to the regime.
Again, there is change coming up from below,
Yeah.
and when I was in North Korea last summer, I was also very impressed at how well, at least part of the public seemed to be familiarized with South Korean pop culture. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to undermine the regime itself, but it does create a certain gap between what people are told and what they know about the outside world. And there's talk now of North Korea opening up internet access a little bit more. As far as the Gangsong Daeguk, which is a phrase that the North Koreans themselves, I think somewhat to their regret, translate as a powerful and prosperous country, because it doesn't necessarily mean prosperous. It really has to do with being powerful and being strong. And there's been, in the recent year or so, a lot less emphasis on the prosperous side of it, and sort of downplaying of the economic upsurge that they had been predicting before. So I think that come April 15th, the 100th anniversary of Kim Il-sung's birth, the North Korean government can simply declare themselves a powerful and prosperous country and get on with it. I don't think there's going to be any real danger in not having achieved these economic goals as far as regime stability is concerned.
They'll put a spin on it.
Mm-hmm. Please.
Neil Friedman from Queens College. U.S. policy towards South Korea is a combination of incentives and disincentives, like carrots and sticks, right? And
North Korea or South Korea?
I'm sorry, toward North Korea.
Yeah.
It's a combination of carrots and sticks. Same with South Korea. And it seems like when the administration changes in Washington or in Seoul, either the carrot gets bigger and the stick gets smaller, or the stick gets bigger and the carrot gets smaller. Now, psychologists always say that positive reinforcement is more effective than negative reinforcement. So, is there any analysis, say, in the intelligence community, since you used that term, about what incentives the North Koreans really like or really respond to? From the little gossip I've heard about the ruling family, what they really want to do is go to Disneyland and settle for some second-rate theme park in China. So I mean, should Obama just simply invite the family to Disneyland? Or I'm only being half facetious when I say that.
Do you want to go or do it?
Now, look, I've been around this on the policy side of things for almost 20 years, and it's not a mystery what the incentives might be to make progress on this. They haven't changed in 20 years. There's energy, there's food, there's nuclear energy,
Idea of normalization.
normalization of relations, economic and political. There are all these things, and they're all out there, and the problem is we haven't really gotten, part of the problem is we haven't really gotten far enough down the road to achieve our ultimate objective in the past, which was denuclearization. I want to add, I think in the current situation, I think denuclearization will be extremely difficult to achieve. And so what we are looking at now, if you are looking solely at the WMD part of this, is trying to stop their program and then to start to reverse it. Those are our objectives in the near term. because the North Koreans have shifted. They're not the same they used to be 20 years ago. They've shifted gears, and now they see nuclear weapons as important for their national security.
I want to make one comment on the sticks. I'm going to sound like a hardliner, but I am not. But I don't know what sticks that we actually use with North Korea, from both the United States and from South Korea. I mean, it's.
Military exercise in the West.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's right. Military exercises and sanctions. Yeah, right. But I just don't think it's enough for North Koreans to have really felt deterred necessarily from us. I mean, from South. I mean, just look at their own history with South Korea. They blew up a Korean airliner. They blew up half of the cabinet in Burma. They've done all these things. And what?
In the 80s.
Right. I mean, exactly. So what? I don't know if there were this range of real sticks that we ever even use. I'm not saying that we should use it. Just saying I don't. I
think Sue's absolutely right. When you say carrots and sticks, yeah, sure, that's that's what the arrows you have in your quiver. They're all carrots or they're all sticks. The problem is finding the right combination. And the other problem is, quite honestly, I mean, I've been around sanctions for 20 years on this issue, and there are very definite limits to those kinds of things. Particularly when you have China. There's a big hole in any sanctions regime, and it's called China. So this is the challenge that faces a decision maker.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Tim Wendt. I'm a research fellow from the business school. I would just like to get maybe a clarification, maybe a little expansion on something that Mr. Witt just said. This goes back into history, and I recall back when the nuclear issue started to arise, the way we were reading about it was North Korea wanted to use that as a bargaining chip, that they weren't getting enough attention, and this was going to force the Americans to pay attention, to give them respect, and try to deal with them in a internationally respectful way. I get the impression of what we just said, that however, if that was ever true, that's certainly not true anymore, that nuclearization now has taken on a life of its own within North Korea. And the North Koreans don't begin any longer to see that as a bargaining chip, but rather to see it as an asset that they would only grudgingly, if they'd even negotiated about it at all. But is that correct? Has the nature of nuclearization in the minds of the North Koreans changed substantially now from what we were told it was when it began 20 years ago?
Yeah, well, if you look at the history, or at least I think, if you look at the history of their nuclear program, which actually dates back to the late 50s, early 60s. So, you've got almost 50 years of history here. If you look at the history, I think during the first phase up until around 1989, they were seriously interested in building nuclear weapons. And so by the 1980s, you had a lot of momentum behind that program to the extent that, they could have enough material for 100 nuclear weapons by the year 2000. Then there's the second phase, which started, I think, in the late 1980s and ran until about 2002, where the North Koreans did shift gears and thought that this could be a bargaining chip for something they wanted even more than having nuclear weapons, and that was a better relationship with the United States. They didn't want that, for anything other than realist reasons, and that was they lost their main allies, the Soviet Union and China, which was trying to improve relations with South Korea. So they wanted to counterbalance that. Then if you go to 2002, to the current situation, I would say that you have a shift back to North Korea seeing nuclear weapons as an integral part of their national security strategy to safeguard their country. So you've had a shift back. And that's why I say I think denuclearization is going to be very difficult. But and there's a caveat here, and I'm not sure how big a caveat it is. I think the North is willing to deal on their nuclear program in terms of maybe the growth and maybe even reversing it, because they still feel they need to repair relations with the United States, and they're uncomfortable with how close they are to China these days. They're very close. So it's more of a realist, they have a realist view of their security policy. That's my analysis, at least.
Please. While the mic is heading over there, let me add, this is sort of an inside the Korean system question from the audience that came in earlier. After Kim Il-sung's death, Kim Jong-il made the National Defense Commission a core organ of North Korea in the name of military first, but Kim Jong-un first took power in the Workers' Party, and he's not a member of the NDC now. Is this a sign that the NDC status has declined and the military influence on domestic politics would be weakened in the Kim Jong-un period?
Sounds like a question for you.
That's not true.
Go ahead.
Well, actually, I think that's not true, because in December 31, they had the Workers' Party meeting where he was actually named the commander-in-chief of the military. But I don't know if it's necessarily head of the...
He was vice chair of the party Central Military Commission, but not in number 2, I think, in the National Defense Commission. He actually is a member, I believe.
Jong-un.
Kim Jong-un.
Yes.
yes. So, so actually, he, by proclamation anyway, he is the commander-in-chief of the military by title. So.
Okay, please.
I'm Jeong-Ho. I'm a student at Weatherhead, East Asian Institute. The United States is reportedly withdrawing its troops from Iraq and probably from Afghanistan in the near future. Does that mean that the United States will be able to focus more on East Asian security issues, regional security issues, and will that affect any Chinese or South Korean negotiation stance? Will that urge North Koreans to move more to compromise with the United States or South Korea?
Does anybody know what the pivot to Asia means?
No. Pivot to Asia, right? The Obama administration is clearly focused on Asia, made this huge, went on to the trip. Now you have 2,500 soldiers in Australia and the whole thing. But national security folks was also argued, but there's a huge defense cut coming on the way. So that's almost a question that's like, it's a debatable. Some folks argue that that's all great and dandy, but how are you going to really do that with this big, enormous defense cut? So in reality, I don't know how much is going to really change in terms of, to the point that it will affect North Korea or China's negotiating policy.
There's a, I'm not someone who spent my life in the State Department, and so that doesn't explain why I keep talking about diplomacy. But there's a real disconnect between our diplomacy and our real capabilities. And I think you've almost put your finger on that. And that is that, the future, I think the future holds for us, in spite of whatever our pivot is, that we're going to have less military capabilities out there. We have to cut our defense budget a lot. I don't know how many troops are going to end up in Asia, but I'm willing to bet there's going to have to be some sort of drawdown. So at the same time that, our resources for military resources in Asia are going to start gradually going down, what should our diplomacy be doing? Should we be trying through diplomatic means to deal with potential threats to our allies and to our overall interests in the region? Or should we just kind of not be dealing with them diplomatically? And so at the end of the day, we'll end up with a situation where, we've let these threats kind of grow and grow and grow, and at the same time, our military capabilities in the region are going to decrease, and our allies are going to see that. You're from Japan. People from South Korea are going to notice that too. What is the impact going to be on our alliances then? So there's a real, we need to be thinking a little bit about connecting these dots, and we're not.
Anybody else want to take that? You want to this side? Yes, please.
I'm John Koch. I'm a political historian. Until it gets here. I just want to step back a minute and focus on two issues with respect to North Korea, which kind of is the...
It's on. It's for the video.
Regime legitimacy and power dispersion. Professor Rowe read the editorial, which sounded like a revolutionary track, and I think it's useful to realize that we are dealing with a regime that's a revolutionary regime, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Now, is the revolution complete yet? Can it ever be complete without North Korea prevailing on the peninsula politically or militarily? Professor Armstrong actually wrote a book on the North Korean Revolution. So I think one of the key ways of assessing whether North Korea will be responsive to U.S. policy initiatives is to try and get a handle on whether, how North Koreans might define their revolution. If this regime is a revolutionary regime in perpetuity, then we have to recognize that fact. In terms of power dispersion, to me it's very interesting. Kim Il-sung, the little I know about the way he consolidated power, was he actually went through a pretty brutal crackdown on his enemies in rising to the top of the heap. Kim Jong-il also fended off opposition and the rumors of truth and so forth. Now we have a situation where basically there are two personalities. I understand that Kim Il-hee and Jung Se-taek, who were the immediate guardians of Kim Jong-il's power, with Kim Jong-un kind of the face of the revolution. Can they keep that power in their hands? Do they have the skills? Do they have the respect and so forth? Or is it likely to disperse? And that creates a whole new dynamic which didn't exist in the Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung era. If we can get a handle on those two areas, I think that would go a long way in enabling us to assess the likelihood of some sort of a deal actually being realized after several decades.
Do you know?
Do you comment with the second part or the first part?
Well, I think the first part, just quickly,
yeah.
I'm sure, Charles, you probably know more about it, but the revolution is probably reunification. It's upon reunification is the kind of the end of North Koreans' purpose behind their existence.
So in that sense, it is revolution in perpetuity because because it's not just a unification; it's North Korea-led unification. It's North Korea.
Well, I mean, if it's
right?
the other
so
unification,
so it's
then
not
North
going to
Korea
happen.
disappears, so it doesn't matter.
As long as far more attractive and economically, I mean, it's there's South Korea, so so they'll forever be engaged in this revolutionary struggle, right? On the Jang Sung-taek, Kim Kyung-hee thing, I think you made an excellent point, and that's a key gap that we don't know much about. I mean, we know that they are key figures. Jang Sung-taek was #2 most powerful and influential person. He still is, obviously, but we don't know. I always wanted to know how much he really supported Kim Jong-un and what he thinks about this whole thing. But I would just comment that if it is a power-sharing kind of agreement where there's Jang Sung-taek and Kim Kyung-hee and Kim Jong-un is really just a figurehead, that's why I think it's going to be, that's not really a stable arrangement forever. You have to remember there's never such power-sharing arrangement ever in North Korean history. There's only been 2 North Korean leaders, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. And I think that I just don't see that as a stable way of operating in North Korea, a power collective kind of leadership.
I think that's right. There was one serious challenge to one-man rule, and that was in 1956 when different groups within the leadership tried to overthrow Kim Il-sung when he was on a trip to Eastern Europe, and that was very harshly cracked down upon. And that's really the origins, I think, of this hereditary succession. That's exactly what the North Korean system is set up to avoid. So it will be interesting to see if they can move in the direction of collective leadership. I would guess that this is a caretaker government, Jang Sung-taek, Kim Kyung-hee, behind Kim Jong-un as he consolidates power. The question is how soon and how skillfully will he be able to do that?
Right.
Just one last point. Once again, I'm not as expert as all these people on the internal dynamics here, but since you asked about the connection to policy, you know, in the years I spent in the government, I could sit through many debates between intelligence analysts about these kinds of issues, and they're all intelligent, bright people who may have different views. Then as a policymaker, what do? You know, you can't wait for some, you know, definitive sign about what is going on. You have to test the waters yourself. You have to figure out what your interests are and how do you test the waters and how do you get to securing your interests. Otherwise, you're going to be sitting through debates ad nauseum without doing anything, because waiting for definitive answers is a recipe for paralysis.
May I just say something on that very point? You're dealing with North Korea. I think you have to ask yourself, are they realists on their side? Or are they dogmatists in terms of adhering to their revolution? I mean, what's driving their policy? Is it adherence to completing the revolution? Is the revolution complete? Or are they attempting to work out new diplomatic relationships with the United States and so on? Isn't there a way of testing them? I mean, how would you?
Yes, there is a way of testing them. You sit down and talk to them and see if you can reach agreements that are in your interest. And then you see how they implement those agreements. And you build into those agreements safeguards, you know, in case they don't implement their side of the bargain. That's basically how you do it. And so, you know, the February meeting may be a first step in figuring out, well, what's this new regime all about?
Just my personal view is that they are realists. And even this unification, this revolution thing, they said, and they, of course, all the rhetoric is there, but I do think that they themselves know that's not, it's really not a feasible thing, North Korea-led unification. I think they have that understanding.
In some ways, I think the North Koreans are more realistic than we are, and less ideological. So I do think that.
More questions? Yes, please.
Mark Barry with the Summit Council in Washington. I've met a number of you before in the past 20 years. I have a very hypothetical question. I actually agree very much with Joel that there's been probably too much contingency planning, and that I believe that the Kim regime is definitely here to stay for some years to come. At the same time, the unexpected could always happen in totally unexpected ways. What would you as a panel suggest that if somehow the DMZ were to sort of disappear in hopefully a non-dangerous way, and where the South Koreans would be able to play a significant role in assimilating North Korean society, what more specific do you think the South Koreans could do for the psychology of the North Korean people that have been raised you know, for 60-some odd years under a certain kind of ideology and mentality? And also, in what ways could the U.S. help and assist that process? I know it's totally hypothetical, but the thing is, somewhere down the road, we may have to address those very kinds of issues.
Well, this is precisely my point. You say there's a lot of contingency planning. We don't have a reconstruction plan. I think North Koreans, if there's ever unification, it's going to be a tremendous tragedy. Even look at how the North Korean defectors are treated in South Korea. They are second-class citizens. They are, it's as a prime example how they don't adjust well in South Korea. In fact, that's a good study right there on how to assimilate North Koreans. These people are grown up in a completely ideologically indoctrinated society. The education system was completely different. And these are all the social issues, just one of many issues that we need to think about, because okay, maybe it's not in 5 years, it's not next 10 years, maybe it's in 20 years. But I don't think we are, as a region, the country, South Korea, US, China, or even any academic communities, a lot of times when we get together to talk about unification scenario, we talk about WMD, loose nukes, refugees, defectors flowing, and this and that, but they don't really go further than that to really think about all these serious societal issues that's going to come about with unification.
I mean, it's a really good question in the sense of hypothetical, but I don't think there's anything you can prepare beforehand. When it happens, then it has to happen, and you deal with it from there. But to prepare for a contingency that might never occur, or we don't know in which manner it will occur, I think would be very, very difficult.
How can you say unification will never occur as a Korean?
That may never.
Come on.
Rewind the tape. You'll see it may never occur.
We have time
grandparents will roll.
I just want
time for one
I just want to add one more thing to that, which is that actually this has happened before. In the fall of 1950, when the U.S. 8th Army crossed the 38th parallel into North Korea, the whole system there was dismantled. Kim Il-sung and his crew regrouped to the northern boundary region with China, and that's actually a very instructive lesson on what not to do. There was a whole State Department contingency plan, which is well worth reading now, about the reorientation and rehabilitation of North Korea, which had only been a regime in existence for 5 years, but nevertheless was still already pretty powerful. Statues of Kim Il-sung had to be melted down, and there are many, many more of them now. So, we do have this kind of history. Invasion of Iraq is another example of what not to do. So, if we don't have a good idea of what we can face and what to expect, we should at least be looking very carefully at the mistakes to avoid.
Well, of course, there's also the German example, and that turned out to be much more arduous, I think, than anyone predicted, and the Korean Peninsula would be many times more difficult. We have just one minute left. Yes, please. Very briefly.
Hey, I'm Rhonda Hogan, and I'm a correspondent to the UN. Was for All My News English, but now at tots.de. And my question is about the peace treaty. That essentially that's an important issue for North Korea, is a peace treaty. And I'm looking back to 2005 and September 19th, and there was an agreement of the 6-party talks, and when things were about to go forward, and then Banco Delta Asia came out by the U.S. And I thought that Ross Carlin was part of a successful negotiating team in the 90s. And what he said was the problem was Washington, not the North Koreans. He found he could negotiate with North Korea once they figured out the language and the differences in understandings and language. So somehow the North Koreans put a peace treaty as critical because the hostility from the U.S. is some of what they see as the critical thing that has made trouble for them.
Okay,
does the panel feel? Is there any way to get a peace treaty negotiation going, and so we can get out of the hostility issue?
There's probably a long answer and a short answer to this. So the short answer is that in any engagement policy, the standard operating procedure is we're going to have a roadmap. And the roadmap's going to lay out what we're going to do, what they're going to do on a lot of different issues. And so as part of the roadmap, there's definitely going to have to be, we're going to have to replace the armistice with permanent peace arrangements. How you key that to the other parts of the roadmap is a difficult issue. But I would say that, yes, you need to deal with that if our end objective is peace and stability.
But I would just add that what the U.S. government is kind of concerned about with North Korea seeking peace treaty is that, of course, North Koreans want peace treaty. It also removes justification for our troops, U.S. troops, being in South Korea. So it has larger ramifications if we remove peace treaty. Because
the U.S. doesn't want a peace treaty, so it would have to remove it.
Well, I'm just saying it's more complicated. It's not. North Koreans. That's another reason why North Koreans want peace treaty, because it removes the justification of us being there.
Okay, we obviously have much more to discuss, but we're out of time. Maybe we can have another session to follow up. Let's take the remaining time to thank our panelists for a really terrific session.